In the olden days, if you wanted your crops to grow, you had a few options. You could pray to Baal, the storm god, basically the most popular deity in the ancient world. Or, if you were feeling particularly desperate about the harvest, you could go down the street to his associate Moloch and see if handing over your firstborn child to be burned and eaten helped things along. Ancient religion was this whole thing. This Old Testament pagan god that gets a lot of headway has the reputation for being the god that the Israelites always go back to worshiping. Somehow. Even as far as saying that the God of the Bible, Yahweh, was actually at one time Baal himself. And there's a thing that gets passed around online, mostly in the kind of spaces where people are very excited to tell you something that everything you believe is wrong. Now, I do that sometimes too, but at least I do it in a fun way. But this one in particular goes something like this. The God of the Bible isn't actually original. Yahweh is just basically a copy of Baal, this older Canaanite storm god, and the Israelites just took their neighbor's religion, changed the name, and then called it a day. And the people saying this will point to real stuff, actual ancient texts, like real parallels between the Canaanite mythology and the Bible. And it actually sounds pretty condemning if you've never heard of it before. And honestly, some of that evidence is genuinely there. One of which being that the Bible seems to include particular passages that sound eerily similar to those found in other literature, other pagan literature of the time. I'm not even going to tell you that the people who found them are making it up. But while all that stuff may be true, it seems to me that everyone seems to be missing the point of why it's in there in the first place. Because here's what I actually think is happening. And, this is the thing that got me absolutely hooked, with this topic when I first came across it. I think the writers of the Old Testament knew exactly what they were doing when they included passages like them. Actually, there are a handful of times that the biblical authors, for the Old Testament in particular, take things from the other surrounding religions of the time and completely dismantle them. And that shouldn't be surprising because of how silly the Israelites were to go off and worship Baal, off and on in the first place. So they knew the Baal mythology. They knew his titles, his stories, and, the whole deal. And rather than accidentally taking it for their own religion and mixing it in with Yahweh, I think they were systematically taking it apart. Taking Baal's best stuff, his powerful abilities, his titles, and ultimately shoving it down his throat one piece at a time, over centuries, as a deliberate argument against Baal himself, and using it for an argument for Yahweh instead. Some might call it borrowing, but I like to call it systematically destroying. And the wild thing is, this argument doesn't even end in the Old Testament as one might think. It ends in a Roman courtroom with the high priest tearing his clothes because of Jesus himself. And it's probably one of my favorite moments, or at least one of my favorite moments of Jesus in the whole entire Bible. I'm going to be coming back to that. Keep that in mind for later. So hello everyone, today we are talking about Baal. And before anything else, we need to talk about him because if you only know him from the Bible, he just probably seems like some generic false god that Israel kept getting in trouble for worshiping. And like one of many, and he was unfortunately a lot more than that. Side note, people pronounce his name differently, Baal, Baal, Baal. I'm going to say Baal because I've always said it that way and because I have Baal knowledge. Anywho, if you enjoy deep biblical deep dives like this one, please consider hitting the subscribe button as it helps out my channel a lot. And with that all being said, and without any further ado, let's get into it. So in 1928, a farmer in what is now Syria was plowing his field, and then his plow hit something. And what came up turned out to be the ruins of a Bronze Age city called Ugarit, which had been buried since about 1200 BC. And inside the ruins was a palace archive full of clay tablets. And on those clay tablets was basically the entire mythology of the Canaanite religion. The stories they told about their gods were written down and preserved, and they were just sitting in the ground for 3,000 years waiting for a farmer's plow. And the main character of all of those stories is this gentleman by the name of Baal. The name just means Lord or Master. It's actually a title, not necessarily his name, which was, his name was probably Hadad, which means something like the thunder. So he's a storm god. He controls the rain. He controls the lightning. He controls the winter storms that blow off in the Mediterranean Sea. And here's why that matters. The people who worshipped him lived in an area in what we now call Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, where farming was almost always entirely dependent on those winter rains. No rain, no crops. No crops, everyone dies. It's just that simple. So Baal was the answer to whether your family ate this year. And the stories about him, which the scholars call the Baal cycle, follow him through a few different big conflicts. The first being he defeats this sea monster called Yam, which is actually just the word for sea in Hebrew, hence the word Yam Suf, which we translate to Red Sea or Sea of Reeds. Anyways, and through that he essentially becomes king of the gods, and then he builds his palace on a mountain. Then he dies. He descends into the realm of Mot, who is the god of death, and then the earth goes barren, and then the rain stop. And then his sister, Anat, who is honestly one of the most terrifyingly violent figures in ancient mythology, finds Baal, takes revenge on Mot, and then Baal comes back, the rain returns, and the agricultural cycle starts again. So death and resurrection every year, hence the term Baal cycle. And this religion was everywhere. If you lived in Canaan, which includes, Israel, and you had a pulse, you knew who Baal was. People named their children after him the same way we would name a kid Gerald, Rufus, or Dave. And I think this gets lost when you read the Old Testament prophets yelling about Israel worshiping Baal, because it can sound like, how are you people this stupid? You literally just watched God part the Red Sea, and now you're worshiping a storm god? But that's not what really was happening. The question was always practical. Well, does it rain this year? Are my crops going to come up? Baal had been the answer to that question for centuries. And when there's a drought and your kids are hungry, you try everything. You hedge your bets. You worship Yahweh on the Sabbath, and then you quietly leave the offering at a local Baal shrine on Tuesday, just in case. And there's actually an inscription from ancient Sinai, a real physical artifact, where some Israelite carved something roughly equivalent to Yahweh and his Asherah. Asherah being the goddess from the Canaanite tradition. Someone carved that, an Israelite probably, who apparently saw no contradiction whatsoever in giving Yahweh a divine wife from the religion next door. What other modern religion says that God has a wife? That's how blurred the lines had gotten. So when I tell you that the biblical authors were making a sustained argument against Baal, understand what they were fighting. So it wasn't entirely a simple battle. This was a religion that had been woven into the daily survivor DNA for generations. But that's just some backstory. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating to me. There's a title that shows up for Baal that is, I think, 16 times in the Ugaritic tablets. The stories that are found at Ugarit. It's his signature description, the phrase that tells you beyond any doubt that you're talking about Baal and not some other random deity. The phrase is Rider of the Clouds, the Cloud Rider. Now, if you're anyone in the ancient Near East, if you've heard, any of these stories, which again you have because they're everywhere, that phrase, rider on the clouds or the cloud rider, refers to one thing. It means Baal. It's like if I said the Dark Knight, you'd think of Batman, not some random person who happens to be dark and nightly. It's that specific. But in Psalm 68 verse 4, it says, "Sing to God, sing praises to his name, extol him who rides on the clouds." It's the same phrase, but referring to a different deity entirely. Yahweh. And okay, you could maybe look at that one instance and say, well, maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe the psalmist just, liked the idea of riding on clouds. But it doesn't happen once. It happens 4 times. 4 different places in the Old Testament where the biblical author takes this very specific title that everyone in their audience would have immediately associated with Baal and then hands it to Yahweh. And the move that they're making is, it's quite obvious once you see it. The thing is, the thing that you think Baal is, Yahweh actually is. The thing you credit to Baal, i.e. the rain, the clouds, like the whole shebang there, that's Yahweh. Baal has nothing. And it's not even just that title, it's actually bigger than that. There's a Psalm 29 to be exact, that a lot of biblical scholars actually think started as a Baal hymn. Like, the original version of this thing was probably sung in honor of Baal. And then someone adapted it for Yahweh. And when you read it knowing that, it's almost funny in a way, because it's this incredibly strange poem about the voice of God thundering over the waters, breaking the cedars of Lebanon, and shaking the wilderness. So we have all this storm imagery, of course. Convenient. Every single image is from Baal's domain, his whole area of expertise. And the entire point of the poem is, this is Yahweh. Not Baal, Yahweh. And with that, there's also this interesting creature called Leviathan that shows up several times in the Old Testament, in Psalm 74, Isaiah 27, and in Job. And Leviathan is described as a multi-headed sea serpent that Yahweh defeats. And in the Ugaritic tablets, Baal fights this essentially identical serpent called Lotan. It's the same creature with basically the same name. They're etymologically linked. It's just a fancy way of just saying how we know what words means. But in the Baal cycle, Baal defeating Lotan is the basis of his kingship, or how he becomes king. So it's his foundational heroic act. And then in Isaiah 27, the description of the monster, the fleeing serpent and the twisting serpent, is almost a word-for-word identical to how the Ugaritic text described Lotan. Except in Isaiah, guess who kills it? It's not Baal, it's Yahweh. And so every time Baal gets credit for something, the biblical authors are quietly moving in and reassigning that credit over and over and over again. And then there's also this Elijah story, which honestly, even just knowing what I've told you now, you might read it completely differently. So for 3.5 years, there's this drought in Israel. There was no rain, which, remember, is like the one thing Baal is supposed to be in charge of and good at. His whole divine job description is sending the winter rains. And for 3.5 years, there's absolutely nothing. So the land is dying and Baal is just sitting up there. I guess Elijah will tell us what he's doing. So Elijah the prophet shows up and proposes a contest to the prophets of Baal. Both sides are to prepare a sacrifice on Mount Carmel, which is right on the border of Phoenicia, which is Baal's home turf, essentially. And the rule was simple. The God who answers with fire from heaven is the real God. And so the prophets of Baal go first, and they dance around the altar, and then they shout, and then they cut themselves, which was actually a specific mourning ritual in Canaanite religion, something they did when Baal died each year. And ultimately, nothing happens. And then Elijah walks up, and he starts mocking them. He's like, well, maybe Baal is meditating, he says, or maybe he's traveling, maybe he's asleep, or maybe he's even relieving himself. And this is not only legendary trash talk by an Old Testament prophet of Yahweh, because in the Ugaritic tablets, after Baal dies, like I said, his sister Anat goes to the sun goddess Shepesh, and then they go searching for him. And the texts just keep repeating this, that he needs to be awakened. And so Elijah knows those stories. So he's not making up random jokes, which is just honestly hilarious to me. He's literally quoting their own mythology back at them, saying, yeah, I've read your texts, I know your God, and I'm telling you your own stories in what they already hint at, i.e., he's not going to answer. And so all Elijah needs to do is pray once, and then boom, fire falls from heaven. And then this is the part that I think most people don't pay enough attention to. The rain actually just immediately returns, like the same day. So the drought that Baal could not end ends immediately. And then the God who has sent fire is also the God who sends the rain. So he wins on Baal's own terms in Baal's own territory, doing the one thing that Baal was supposed to do. Now, here's where everything we've been talking about ties together, and one of the most amazing displays I've ever, read done by Jesus. We know that the Cloud Rider title, the Rider of the Clouds, is Baal's signature phrase. It gets applied to Yahweh 4 times in the Old Testament. 4 times the biblical authors take this specific title and then hand it to God. And every time, the meaning is the same. Baal doesn't control the clouds, Yahweh does. The 5th time, however, that this phrase appears in Daniel chapter 7. But this time, it's not applied to Yahweh, the God of the Bible. Daniel has this vision. He sees this ancient white-haired figure, God, sitting on the throne of fire surrounded by his heavenly court. There are thousands of angels, and books are being opened, and there's a rather interesting judgment happening, whatever is going on. And then a second figure appears, Daniel writes, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, one who comes with the clouds of heaven. Now, if you've grown up hearing the Baal stories, if that phrase has meant one thing in your entire life, this is the moment that you wake up, because that phrase means the divine king who defeats chaos and receives eternal kingship is a son of man. And Daniel is using it for this second figure, this mysterious son of man, which in Hebrew just means human one. It's not a title at that point, it's just the word for a human being who approaches the throne and receives the kingdom that will never end. So there are 2 different figures here, and yet both of them are somehow divine. One looks like an ancient king, one of them looks like a human being, and the human-looking one gets the eternal kingdom with Baal's title. Now, here's what baffles my mind. The structure of Daniel's vision tracks almost exactly with the Baal cycle. In the Baal stories, you have El, the elderly, fatherly head of, the gods, presumably like God, presiding over the divine council, and Baal, the younger warrior, receives kingship. Daniel has the Ancient of Days presiding over the heavenly court, the divine council, and the Son of Man receives the eternal kingdom. It's the same thing, but the biblical authors have been arguing for centuries that everything that the Baal cycle describes is actually true of Yahweh. So now you have two figures, both are Yahweh, occupying the roles that the Baal stories gave to two separate gods. And the one who gets the kingdom, the one with the cloud rider language, is human. So that part of the story is that in the Baal stories. Baal is a god who dies and comes back in a cycle every single year. The Son of Man in Daniel 7 is a human being who receives a kingdom that never ends. And this vision became a huge deal in Jewish theology between the Old Testament and New Testaments, that intertestamental period. Rabbis argued it, for centuries, who is this second figure, this second power in heaven, as they called it. And there's a ton of writing from that period, Jewish writing speculating about who exactly the Son of Man in Daniel 7 actually is. And then Jesus shows up. So it's the night before the crucifixion, and then Jesus is standing before Caiaphas, the high priest. Caiaphas has been trying to find something he can use against him, and he's getting a little frustrated. Finally, he just directly asked Jesus, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And then Jesus says something really, really interesting. Matthew 26:64. "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." That's Daniel 7 that Jesus just quoted, word for word. And Caiaphas gets it immediately. The next verse is him tearing his robes, which is the sign of Jewish culture of hearing genuine blasphemy, like serious blasphemy. So there it is. He doesn't need any more witnesses. He has what he needs. Jesus is going to be crucified. Because Jesus isn't just saying that he's the Messiah. He's claiming to be the figure in Daniel 7, the Son of Man, the one who comes with the clouds, the cloud rider. He's claiming to be the end point of an argument that the biblical authors had been making for 1,000 years. The thing that you thought Baal was, the divine king who defeats chaos and death and rules forever, that's me. And I'm going to prove it to you by going through death and coming out the other side. The Baal cycle had death and resurrection every year, a way of explaining the seasons, a myth about why the rains come back. And what the biblical story is arguing from the Psalms to Daniel to this moment in the courtroom with Jesus is that there's going to be one death and resurrection that isn't a cycle, one that actually does something, one that ultimately ends it. And Caiaphas knew exactly what Jesus was claiming when he said it. He'd spent his whole life in those texts. He understood the Daniel 7 debate. He knew what the cloud rider language meant, and then he tore his clothes. Jesus claimed to be one with Yahweh. But I want to say one more thing before we tie this all together because I think it's important. So the Ugaritic tablets, the Baal stories we've been talking about this whole video, those were discovered in 1928. The people who wrote the Psalms, who wrote Daniel, who shaped the Hebrew Bible over centuries, had no idea that we would ever find those tablets. They weren't writing to us today, like that through biblical scholarship, we'd be able to figure this stuff out. They were writing for their own people in their own time. And yet, when you lay the Baal cycle next to the Hebrew Bible and see what they're doing, the systematic way they took his titles, his battles, like the Baal imagery, and his very death and resurrection structure, and spent 1,000 years redirecting all of it towards something else entirely, it's hard to feel like you're not watching something that knew where it was going the whole time, right? Like the argument started in the Psalms, made its way to the prophets, to be included with more detail in the book of Daniel, and then it finally came to fruition in a courtroom in the middle of the night with the high priest tearing his robes because the man standing in front of him had just told them that the whole thing was true. Jesus claimed to be God. I find that rather remarkable. Whatever you make of it, I genuinely find that remarkable. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, if you did enjoy this video or enjoy deeper biblical deep dives, please hit the subscribe button as there's so much more to cover and talk about. And yeah, actually, this is a shorter video. I can't believe 20-minute video is short for me. But let's be real, this video probably could have been 40 minutes. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but I don't know. To me, it's one of my favorite examples of Jesus claiming to be God, you know? I just find it so unbelievably fascinating. Like this whole idea that the biblical authors, it's so interesting throughout the whole Old Testament that the biblical authors were just like dealing with the religions around them, like of the time that they were writing it, you know, all these pagan religions. And they were just taking whatever these other gods were doing and just saying, yeah, your God sucks. Like we have the true God, Yahweh. And he's literally doing he can do everything that your gods can do and like 10 times better, which is also really sad because they just went and worshiped Baal anyways. I'm rambling. Have a nice day.